All right, ask me something.
Yeah, so that first one that I sort of mentioned, when
Start
you...
anywhere you like.
Yeah. Now, I know that you talk about how, the secret history and all that sort of stuff, but what's the first ever thing? Did you just one day go, what is that? And now I want more of it. Like, how does it all begin for you? Take us back to the beginning.
Sorry, my sense of humour is atrocious, so I just have to remember not to get into that.
No, I love it. Continue.
No, it starts a lot earlier than the moment that you're talking about, which I'll get to, but it might surprise you, but I grew up shy, small, and very non-assertive. I hated history when I left high school, and I realised that was a lot to do with my immaturity. I was far too young to be in high school, but it was also about the way in which the history lessons were provided. My image of a teacher called Spot Burrows, we call him Spot, I don't know what his real name was, but he used to come in. I had him for 5 years in history at Boys High, and he used to come in with the textbook and he'd say, "Where am I up to, boys?" And we'd tell him where he was up to, because we'd written down everything he said. Oh, okay. And he'd proceed to read out of the book. There was no discussion of any kind. I'm talking the 1950s. No discussion of any kind. And there was no Australian history at that time. It wasn't that they didn't teach it, there wasn't any. It was said officially by various people, Leone Kramer and so on, that there was no Australian history. So we used to get the royal family. I remember I had books full of the Chinese Revolution and the Russian Revolution and so on, which I understood nothing about. Absolutely nothing. Nevertheless, I passed the leaving certificate in history and a few other things. So I went into Teachers College, and I get out into the primary school, Bush School it was, and all of a sudden I'm expected to teach snotty-nosed country kids history, among other things. And it was all, the whole of the curriculum thing was in turmoil at that stage. So I think I went through the Wyndham scheme and Cuisenaire and all sorts of stuff, none of which made any difference. And it wasn't until years later that I realised, well, I should have been teaching them, or at least starting it. Hello there. Should I stop?
No, keep going.
Keep going.
It was only later that I realised what I should have been doing was talking to those children about their own locale, talking to them about their own lives. It's only when you can locate kids in a situation that they know and are familiar with that you can broaden it out and talk about anything else. But anyway, so I hated history when I came out of high school, but I found that I was actually interested in history because I began to teach myself how to do it. I had to teach myself how to do research. I had to teach myself what Australian history was about, and totally overwhelmed the very poor introduction that I'd had to it. But I was also a perennial student. I decided that probably the safest way of life in my case was, because I wasn't very interested in setting up families and houses and also, was to just follow the questions that I had in my head. And that took me from Asian studies to Aboriginal studies into Australian history generally. And I realised that right back at that beginning, when this Spot Burrows was reading out of his book, there was always a sense that something was wrong, that something was missing. It didn't make any sense, the history that we were being taught, but I didn't know why. And it's taken me a long time to realise that history, as you said, Ted, is in the hands of the victors, the people who write the books. And it's still in the hands of the people who write the books. And the battle for information control is probably one of the longest running conflicts around empire and around societies generally that has been going on. And it's also probably one of the most vicious conflicts that have been happening as well. And the reason I'm talking about that is that in rewriting the introduction to my book on friendly societies and fraternal societies in Australia, the question that kept coming up was, okay, I've worked out how invisible these societies are. They're not in the history books, just like Indigenous history was not in the history books and women were not in the history books. Why is it that fraternal societies, which are obviously very important, the evidence is everywhere, you can't avoid the evidence, but they're not in the history books? So the first major question was, why not? So I had to explain to myself and learn how to work out what had happened to an understanding or a recognition that the evidence was there, but it had not registered somehow. And I got into the stuff about controlling the information flow, which I recognised not only gives you the power to determine what goes into the books, it also determines what you leave out. And that's a whole philosophy which has resulted in my rethinking the whole thing about fraternal societies and how they fit into this. But to go to your particular question, when I realised, well, I'd been doing various degrees and trying out different things. I went to this School of African and Oriental Studies in London, and then to the Canberra CAE to do a Masters in Education. At that stage I was very heavily involved in alternative education, cooperative schools, and so there was a lot of reaction against what I'd been through, against the disappointment of what I thought my education had been about. But I wasn't sure what I wanted to fill the gap with. But I decided I'd do a PhD here in Newcastle. That was the logical next step for me. And so I picked out a topic which was the history of May Day in Australia. I come from a Labour history background. Well, I was in a Labour history society at the time. I was Secretary of Newcastle Labour History Society, and I was also on the Australian executive of the Australian Society for the Study of Labour History.
Yeah.
But I found that the study of labour history suffered from exactly the same biases and blind spots that all these other areas of history seem to. So I got out of that and just started asking myself questions. And I was doing this history of May Day, and I came across these trades union banners with all these symbols in them. And I'd go on to Trades Hall and I'd say, excuse me, why is that Masonic symbol in that banner, that trade union banner? We don't talk about Freemasons here. No, it can't be a Masonic symbol. No. So I said, okay. Again, there's this recognition that it's there, but a failure to consider it, a failure to see it as you might see it. And the banners, when I started to look at banners all over Australia, at least the ones that were recorded, the symbols were there all the time. There were angels, and even the handshake turned out to be a long time symbol. But you had all sorts of things. I've seen photographs of made 8-hour day marches in Melbourne with banners with the great big eye of God.
Yeah. Did they have the 888 symbol as well?
The 888 symbol, that was a breakthrough for me because I came across a Mason who was also a member of Newcastle's Labour committees. And he said, well, some of you people will understand 888
Yeah.
much better than anybody else. What? Because the Masons were among the first to actually articulate the idea of a day demarcated into 3 lots of 8 hours. Oh, okay. So why can't the Labor people talk about the Freemasons? They didn't. I nearly got punched in the nose a couple of times when I asked that question.
So it's a bit of like a dangerous association.
Oh, absolutely. The Freemasons were the enemy. They were the enemy of Catholics, but they were also the enemy of the working class. And so if you go on to the Freemasons and say, excuse me, why are those symbols in the trade union banner? Exactly the same reaction. Because they had been told that the Labor Party was not, if not communist, they were certainly radical and opposed to everything that the Freemasons were interested in. So again, you get this situation of everyone knows it's there, but nobody talks about it.
Yeah, so no one wants to talk to each other. You're the one infiltrating both sides, trying to get the answer.
And when
Do you feel safe in
and
that?
I was a member of a trade union, journalists mostly, although I was in the Teachers' Federation as well. And I found that even within the meetings, even within the informal settings, you couldn't get them to talk about certain things that was outside the line, the official line. I joined the Freemasons for exactly the same reason. And I found that the Freemasons wouldn't talk about things that were outside. There was no curiosity, but there was also a sense of a discipline which told you what you needed to know, what you talked about, what you didn't talk about. So it comes back to this notion of who controls the history. All of us have been educated in a similar sort of way, and I call it a Eurocentric view of the world. Okay, and so you get into all the stuff about the mythology of the British Empire. You know, it went around the world colonising everybody in sight because it believed in benevolence and humanity. The fact that they beat the shit out of the local natives and destroyed anything that they didn't like, that's all dropped out. It's all disappeared. So the image presented of the British Empire is totally positive. It's totally false. So you've got generation after generation after generation after generation learning the mythology of what the people writing the books want you to know, and everything else is left out. And that's the particular reason why the Fraternals were left out, because, now this gets complicated. At the time of the French Revolution, just after the American Revolution, you've got this whole notion of a national mythology or a national narrative being created. In order to be future-oriented and progressive, you have to have this image of yourself and your country that you project forward, and it proclaims all the best things and leaves out everything that it doesn't want. And at that time, you've got the mythology being propagated that the only good form of organisation for people generally, the people, is a delegated form. Before 1789, approximately, you've got all these fraternal societies and other organisations which were examples of direct democracy. After the French Revolution, it's all about delegated assemblies. You elect a representative, the representative goes to the assembly, and if you want to complain about what that representative does when he goes to the assembly, you write him a letter. And that's the only point, apart from the actual election itself, that's the only point at which you can apply any pressure. Whereas previously, the decision making was all in the hands of the small groups.
It was much more communitarian.
Yeah. So, and that's the main reason why the Fraternals were disappeared out of the modern histories, because they represented the direct forms of democracy, and that was superstitious, old-fashioned, whatever you like to call it. And the histories from there on are being written in terms of modern, the so-called modern world, which is scientific, rational, enlightened, secular if you can get away with it, and anything that smacked of the previous history is simply dropped out altogether. So you get nothing about the indigenous people, you get nothing about women because they don't count, you get nothing about the environment, you get nothing about a whole bunch of things. Fraternal societies is just one of the victims of that shift. But then you've got a situation in Australia where they suddenly appear. They arrived on the beach in 1788 in the First Fleet, and after a few years of argy-bargy and convicts being beaten up and so on, they start to appear. You get the Oddfellows and the Rechabites and the Freemasons and all of a sudden they're up and running and they've got banners and flags and regalia and lodges spreading everywhere. Oh no, sorry, didn't happen.
Still the same.
It has to be left out. It has to be cut out. So I'm faced with this dilemma. I want to write this history of Australian fraternal societies, and the evidence is everywhere, but nobody wants to talk about it. Certainly the history books don't want to talk about it. So I started collecting quotes from different historians who, a lot of them, Donald Horne, Tom Keneally, a whole bunch of people had an idea that there was something wrong, and they sort of poked at it, but none of them attempted to fill the gap of what was missing. What I've done is try to fill that gap, and unfortunately for you, you are living in a most important part of historical time, because I'm rewriting not only the history of Australia, but the history of the world. Right? Now that's a huge responsibility, but it's something that I've realised when I started to put all these bits and pieces together. I even had to come up with a definition of fraternal societies because there wasn't one. I had to come up with a way of distinguishing between the Rechabites and the Freemasons, or the Grand United Order of Oddfellows and the Manchester Unity of Oddfellows, because there wasn't anything about them. There were no books. There was nothing on the shelves. You couldn't just, oh yeah. So I've been involved in the attempts to fill that gap, but in a way which makes sense. But in order for it to make sense, I have to demolish all its previous history.
And what did the societies think about you bringing to light some of this stuff? Because obviously some of them, the very nature of them is secret. So have you had any conflict with some of these societies about potentially exposing them?
Not all of them. The Loyal Orange Lodges were the ones that showed most concern. Now, I don't know whether the Loyal Orange Lodge means anything to you.
It does.
They had a museum in Parramatta Road for a long time, and they welcomed myself and a bloke called Tony Laffin that you'll hear a lot more about, and we used to go in there and we'd start then they started to think, what are these people about? You know, are they going to expose our secrets or whatever? Now they were a friendly society, or they were operating as a friendly society, which meant that they were supposed to be, by definition, non-political. But the more you look at the records of the Loyal Orange Lodges, you see how political they were. They were part of the shock troops and the street campaign workers and so on when there was an election on. They kept Henry Parkes in power for a long time, as I've said in the book. But you won't find any of them, or the fact that he was a Protestant bigot in any of the books about Parkes. It's just not there. So it's not just the fraternals that have been left out, but it's the whole range of what they were doing. Some of them are political, some of them are very religious, some of them are totally philanthropic. I was talking to Tony yesterday about the societies which are represented at the Singleton Historical Museum. They've got a handful of things about Manchester Unity Oddfellows, because somebody donated the material.
Yeah.
But they have absolutely nothing about the Freemasons or the Loyal Orange Lodges, even though the evidence is there if you actually go looking for it. So they've got certain things but haven't got certain other things. And unless there's a curiosity, why isn't so-and-so there? Or what was that person doing that enabled him to become the Lord Mayor of Singleton? Then you just don't get to fill in the gaps. Sorry, what was the question?
No, you answered the question
Oh.
to a point. Do you have any backlash from sort of the societies? And you mentioned the Loyal Oranges.
Well, I used to do. I was not working, sleeping on people's lounge room floors and hitchhiking down the road. You know, spending as little money as possible. And there was no way that I could explain what I was doing. You know, you'd either talk for 3 days non-stop, as I've just been doing, or you'd run into all these prejudices. Oh, the Freemasons are like that. You'll still see letters to the editor about, in the Newcastle Herald, how the Freemasons were anti the working class, and therefore when the Labour Party appeared at elections, and the Freemasons were always there to do something or other. But I found myself trying to find the people who might be interested. So I used to go and knock on the doors of the Australian Museum, or the, what's the one in Canberra now called? Australian.
National Museum.
Well, the National Library, but also the new one, the National.
Democracy Museum? Democracy Museum?
No.
Australian Democracy.
No, that's the new old Parliament House, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, there's another one. But there was an archive at the ANU. And
National Freemason.
I found that they had all sorts of fraternal stuff, but it was all Manchester Unity. And it had all come from Victoria. There was nothing there from anywhere else except Victoria. Why was it there? Because somebody donated it.
Yeah.
They didn't understand it. There was no background on it. They just had a beautifully organised catalogue, and you could go. But I go to the what is it called? Not the Australian Museum, but something. Anyway, I said, well, look, I've been doing this for a while, and I've got all this regalia, including, you know, a range of Masonic regalia. And the response was, oh, we already have a Masonic apron. We don't need anything else. So not only did they not know what they were talking about, but they hadn't even begun to turn the first stone over, which would have told them that one apron is only the beginning. You know, you've got, well, as many degrees as you like, and go up to 96 if you like. And there are aprons and regalias and rituals and all sorts of things for each of those degrees. So one apron is neither here nor there. I remember I went to, there was a bloke in the Grand United Oddfellows in Sydney that I became very good friends with, and he did have a sense of curiosity. And he'd be going around, and people in the lodges that were closing down, which was happening quite a lot, they'd say, oh, would you like this? And he'd say, what the ... is that? But nevertheless, he used to take it away, and I started to explore what he called Possum Corner, which was under the stairs in Grand United building in Sydney. I said, what's in Possum Corner? And he said, well, I don't really know. I opened the door of Possum. It was a big cabinet, and there was a pile about this high of very colourful certificates. None of them filled in. And I worked out eventually that they'd probably been there since about 1910. Because they were printed in 1907, and none of them been used. Okay.
So there was like membership sort of certificates. Yeah.
If you want me to stop because you've got something you want to say.
No, don't continue.
Because you've got a few blank ones in the collection that we've been
one of the
working
heaviest
on
boxes
too.
at my house is a box full of certificates.
Just empties.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I remember that I went to. I realised that the story was the same all over Australia, right? the fraternals had spread into virtually every hamlet and community. They weren't always there, but the Grand United, for example, had made a push into a certain area. They went up along the New South Wales coast, for example, whereas Manchester Unity went inland and went up the valley. So there were recruiters going into these places and setting up lodges and so on. Sometimes they clashed, depending on what was happening in that particular town. The editor of the local newspaper was often a member of one of the other orders, and so the newspaper for a period was totally biased towards that particular organisation, would leave everything else out. But in some cases you had a bloke say, oh, these are all good and useful organisations, so we'll talk about all of them. All of a sudden a fight would break out for the control of the newspaper. But anyway, this Warren French was his name, and he got this stuff and he thought, some of this stuff is just awkward, you can't store it very well. And we had these about 7 foot high shepherd's crooks. We had to work out what these shepherd's crooks were for. But he decided that because they were from Queensland, he would donate them to the, whatever it's called, the Brisbane Library, State Library. Sometimes the universities are involved in these places and sometimes they're not. Anyway, we wandered up the stairs and into the lift with, I had a shepherd's crook over my shoulder, he had a shepherd's crook over my shoulder. And they're this high. People go, lost your sheep, mate.
That's right, yeah. A flock.
Yeah. And then we walk up to where the librarians are sitting and we say, excuse me, would you like a donation of shepherd's crooks? I don't know. Sometimes they'd take them, sometimes they wouldn't.
Yeah.
Sometimes we'd have to walk back out again for this thing. But coffins would turn up, regalia I've never seen before, certificates I couldn't identify. It was all about trying to accumulate this jigsaw. And eventually I got a lot better at it than I had been in the beginning. So that what I'd been trying to write in the first place, for example, the stuff that's in my PhD, I probably wouldn't own up to anymore because it was back then. Okay. So, and I've just rewritten the introduction to They Call Each Other Brother, because the introduction as it stands in that book doesn't cover what I now know about them. And that's in the last 6 months that I've done that. And I think I'm still learning as well. But you ask about reactions. Freemasons are very interesting. They all have collections of material in their back room usually. You go down to Sydney and ask to see the records of Valhalla Lodge at Broken Hill and something and so on. I said, well, catalogue says where it is. If you can find it, you can look at it.
Right.
It's in that room there somewhere. They don't have the staff, they don't have the resources to do anything other than store the material. Going to Brisbane Library, Brisbane Masonic Grand Lodge, and they say, oh yeah, we're very, come and help us, we've got all this stuff and we don't know what it is. But they catalogued it all under Freemasonry anyway, because Freemasonry is not only the only fraternal society, but it's the biggest and the best and the greatest and so they put it all under Freemasonry. And it could have been anything. It could have been Lord Orange Lodge, it could have been Temperance Group, it could have been Grand United Order of Oddfellows, and it was just there. And they, again, had no resources and not really the background interest in trying to sort out just what it was. In other places, they wouldn't talk to me. No, you're trying to get into our secrets.
Yeah, I was going to ask that because I was thinking when you go and approach places, like do you use your doctor credentials or your Freemason credentials or both?
Or neither.
Or neither, yeah.
Depends. You've got to suss them out. And you go into, say, a museum or a library up the coast somewhere, say Bingara or Tamworth or somewhere, and you say, oh no, we don't know anything about fraternal societies. No, sorry mate. Oh, have you got anything about the The Oddfellows. Oh, yeah. And
So
I'll show you the catalogue.
language is important that
Yeah,
you use.
absolutely. It's what they've been told. I've come across aprons that are just sort of nailed onto the wall of the museum. No caption of any kind. They didn't know what they were. Sometimes you'd run across a person whose father had been a Rechabite or a Freemason or something, and they were gung-ho. You know, they'd sit down with you for hours if they had the time. In other places, no, it's just rubbish, mate. Don't worry about it. So I've got a lot of different reactions. I was talking about not having any money, and so I applied for a fund through the New South Wales Heritage Office. And I thought they'd be at least receptive to the idea. I wanted to go around New South Wales and find out what banners had actually survived. Because you quite often hear stories about banners that haven't survived. There was a whole pile of them at Newcastle Trades Hall. And during the 50s, when there were a lot of Labour faction fights happening, the banners that were in there were simply dumped. They were thrown out. And some of these were the very old ones, 12 foot, 15 foot square. And they just disappeared. Happily, the ones in Sydney survived, and a few in Melbourne, but most of them had disappeared. So I said, oh, I'd like to go around New South Wales, visit as many places as I can, and see what has survived. Oh, yeah, that's a good idea, mate. Okay, we'll give you. And after about 12 months, and I'd found quite a few banners, I was asked the question, which ones are the most valuable? Heritage terms. We want to add a number of these things that you've come across to the Heritage Register. These are items that ought to be preserved. And my response was, well, I don't know. Because I haven't done the work. I haven't done the background work. All I've done is find them. And by that time I was beginning to be able to distinguish a Tuttle's banner from another sort of banner, from another sort of banner. Some of them were double-sided. There was one in the broom cupboard at the Catholic Presbytery in Yass. Beautiful banner, but it had been done locally, double-sided, totally different in style from the other ones that I've been looking at. Oh, it's in the broom cupboard, mate. Oh, okay. Can I get it out and have a look at it? Well, don't know, as you can. Eventually, these things come to light. They've been stuck away somewhere and people don't know what to do with them. Okay. But anyway, the Heritage Office said to me, we would like to add some of these items, and you're the person who nominates what are the most valuable ones. And I said, well, I don't know. So they cut off funding because I couldn't fill the boxes in the way that they wanted. Oh, you must be a scam artist. You're not actually doing what you're supposed to be doing. Yeah.
And how would you value? Would just be by the date of
The
the item?
banner?
Yeah, if you were to do that now, would you do it by the date of the item or?
The condition, or
Well, that's a really funny one. It's a really funny one. It's very important. Let me see. There's one in Melbourne of Foresters, Ancient Order of Foresters banner. Beautiful work they used to do. Double-sided. But when it was stored, it wasn't stored adequately. And the paint that was used very early on, either, I don't know, I suppose it softens if it's stored away in a hot place. And so they tend to stick. They just roll them up. And then when they go and try to open them up, the paint sticks and da-da-da-da. So there wasn't even a recognition of how to store a lot of these things. But anyway, that's one of the oldest banners in Australia. It goes back to about, I think if I remember correctly, 1860 or 1870. It's one of the very earliest ones. And after a while, when you've got a number of photographs, as I have, of banners, you can work out some of the progression. which ones are the tuttles, which ones were done locally, why they shifted from silk to canvas or other things. But part of the conversation with the Heritage Office was, well, which are the most valuable? Now, value in a marketplace depends upon what somebody is prepared to pay for them. There was no market for these items because nobody knew anything about them. You might get a bit of a thing on eBay about Masonic aprons. Somebody might get terribly excited about a Masonic apron they've never seen before. And, oh yeah, I love that one. But the ones that they don't know about just goes through to the keeper, as it were. Anyway, the Heritage Office said, well, you must be able to tell us which is. I've got no idea, mate, because it depends on the market. Oh, okay. We'll get in an independent valuer. Now, there's only one person that apparently was known at the time in the whole of New South Wales who was even prepared to try to value the stuff that I'd collected, like honour boards, certificates, and so on. But that person wanted $2,000 before they'd move out of Sydney to come to Newcastle. They wanted $2,000 up front. Oh, okay. What do they do when they get to my place? Well, they had no idea because they'd never seen most of the stuff before. They certainly don't know what the background is. They couldn't tell the tuttles from any other sort of pattern. And yet they're trying to put a valuation on it, which is then accepted by the Heritage Office and by Australian museums or whatever, as the last word on valuation.
I think there's a conflict there between market value and historic value.
Well,
and how you
absolutely.
determine historic value, I guess, if there's not much history.
But there was no history value,
Yeah.
historical value either, because people didn't know about them. There wasn't any market value because there wasn't a market.
That's right.
Things started to happen overseas in the United States and in the UK. You started to get a bit of a rumbling about how important this stuff was. And so you got a bit of a market. I've got boxes of aprons which are being offered individually on eBay for $100. I've got a whole box of them because at the time that I was starting out, they were just being handed in. Oh, I've finished with that. My dad died. Here. And some of them have a provenance that you can follow, but a lot of them don't have. Because they were made by David Jones or they were made by Anthony Hordens. But when you go into the history of David Jones, you've got a whole new story. They had a place, a regalia making place, and they called it the White Temple.
Right.
Why? Because they were committed to the whole idea of fraternalism. Probably the bloke who set it up was a Freemason or an Oddfellow or something. And so they had catalogues. If you go to the David Jones archives now, which is out in Western Sydney somewhere, they've done a hell of a lot of work, which simply hadn't been distributed to any of the museums or whatever. But it was.
Sorry, is it searchable, the David Jones? Okay.
It was, but they only had. I've been there, and it's a huge warehouse type thing because you can imagine there are all sorts of display items and cash registers and those steam pipes that go up and down. But I haven't been in touch with them for, 20 years now because other things took over. I mean, one of the reasons why you're sitting in a very valuable time in history is because the area is in fact vast. The stuff that we're talking about is vast. You can say fraternal societies, this is a definition, yes. But under that heading, you've got Freemasons, you've got trade unions, you've got friendly societies, and you've got all these other societies, from the Ku Klux Klan right through to the Daughters of Temperance. And they all fit, and they all are part of the story because it's not accidental that they all have secret handshakes, passwords, regalia, colour regalia. But at certain stages, they make some sort of adaptation. And if the government introduces a piece of legislation which says, well, if you're a fraternal association, then you have to do this and you have to do that, you have to do something. For example,
Which they did do.
yes, in the 19th century they started to tell fraternal societies how they would invest their money. You can't do that, you can't do that. Some of the fraternal societies, oh, stuff you, mate, we're just going to do it anyway. Proceeded to go broke or something happened, so they might come back into the fold. But it was the government setting the definitions of what was then taught about the different societies. And nothing whatever to do with the actual history of these organisations. So, for example, you get trade unions that were banned, or trade unions that had to give up any thought of demonstrations, or had to give up any idea of doing something or other. And you get a demarcation between the friendly societies and the trade unions and the Freemasons, which turn into tribal warfare, because they began to regard themselves as quite separate from the Freemasons, for example, and the Catholics separated off from the Protestants, and they became blood enemies.
So you think there was a lot less segregation before that sort of censorship happened?
There was a lot less. The history of religious conflict is a very old one, of course, and certain situations were very tense at certain periods. There were riots, street riots in Melbourne, for example, between the Catholics and the Loyal Oranges at certain times.
Yeah.
Questions in Parliament, ministers sacked, and all sorts of stuff happening. And then you get a quiet period. You go out to the goldfield like Gulgong, or what's that place called? Just out near Gulgong. A little ghost town.
Silverton?
No, too far. Too far. It was a gold strike town. Now it's a ghost town, although various artists are going out there. It's just down near Lithgow. Anyway, Hill End. Hill End. Okay. Miners, quite often recruited from England, mostly Protestant. Therefore, if one of the Protestant politicians wanted to get campaign workers, or wanted to make sure that they got a good vote in the election, they wouldn't stand in Sydney, for example. They'd stand for the seat of Goulburn or whatever, and they could count on a solid block of voters. Okay, if a Catholic stood out there in that same seat, he or she would be likely to be lynched on the way to the polling station. You've got fights and all sorts of things. You've got, when I was going to school, I remember participating in fights, stone throwing fights, Shanghai's, with the kids from the public school. I was at the Catholic school, they were at public school. Catholic, ring the bell, Protestant, go to hell. But you can turn it around, you can say, Catholic, go to hell, Protestant, ring the bell. But I can remember I was chased home one day from school by this huge band of Protestant kids. They didn't know who I was. They wouldn't have known the first thing about Catholicism, but that didn't matter. That was one tribe, that was another tribe.
That's right.
Yeah. But my point about that is that a number of historians, like Russell Ward, who wrote one of the definitive books about mateship in Australia, he was involved in exactly the same sort of sectarian struggles in his own personal life, but it doesn't appear in any of his histories. Donald Horne the same way. He was from Muswellbrook and he said the town is run by Freemasons, but it doesn't appear in any of his history books. It's just left out. Not even personal experience is sufficient to get over the bias of having been taught in a certain way. So I go along and I, excuse me, I'd like to talk about fraternal society. Huh? Oh, was your father ever a Rechabite? Oh yeah, come in. But they've got none of the context. They've got no curiosity about how it fits together. And if you talk to them about British history or whatever, what they give you is what they were taught. It doesn't fit anywhere else. So you and I are rewriting the history of Australia.
One question, like you may
Sorry,
have...
I run on a
No,
No, it's-
that's great. I mean,
We want you
the
to start.
more you talk, it's like we learn more. In other parts of the world, when you had kind of fraternal society, they were mostly known as a secret societies. I'm particularly talking about the Middle Eastern style of fraternal society.
Yeah.
So they were secret societies, and the main goal of these secret societies were reaching the power.
Reaching.
The power,
Power.
like toppling the government or getting the power in the government. So they were very much politics oriented.
Yep.
How was the case in Australia? Maybe then it would be another question that Labour is one of the funding parties that shapes Australia in a sense.
Mm.
And many figures you can argue that they were like at point they were members of the fraternal
Mm.
societies or throughout their life but not telling.
Yep.
So how do you link all those animosities in that context?
By asking the questions and trying to work out what the jigsaw actually looks
Yeah.
like. Each one is going to be different, and that's another reason why I have pretty well no respect for what I find in the published history books, because they haven't asked those questions. Henry Parkes is a good example of someone who was biased, began a newspaper in which you have to hunt to find evidence of his bias. But if you go into his personal records and what survives from his personal records, you find that he was being given a stipend or a supporting bag of money right through his career. And if you look very closely into his newspaper, The Empire, you will find the evidence of his bias, but it's very well hidden. So there were other Protestants who were very militant. He was not so militant. He was more of an influencer by stealth, basically, but also keeping himself in power. Okay, but you won't find anything about that sort of thing in his history. Okay. Secrecy is a whole thing in itself. There's a history of secrecy, and you have to understand, we have to first ask the questions, why on earth were they secret? At a certain point in the evolution of modern society, the government said, oh well, if you're a secret society, you either are banned from here forward, or you have to register. And if you register, then you have to give us an annual report, you have to show us your books, you have to do. But hang on, I'm a secret society, why would I tell the government all of this stuff? So you have an option. You can remain a secret society with one set of books and another set of books that you show the government. Or you can give up all the secrecy altogether. Or you can say, as the Freemasons did, oh, we're not a secret society, we're just a society with secrets. Okay. You know, and if you get away with it, then you get away with it. But of course you have people within the organisation to say, hang on, this is important, our secrecy is part of our history. And it had a purpose. Before 1789, the secrecy in the fraternal societies was like a housekeeping thing. It was a practical consideration, because those societies were attempting to keep out people who were not members of the Brotherhood, because they would take the jobs of the members. So you had to know who was in and who was out.
I've noticed with a lot of this stuff that some of the makers' marks on them are would they have been tied with the societies? You know, the creators of these, like the certificate
Might have
printers,
been. Might have been.
the people that make these boards up.
Yeah, that's another whole area in itself. You've got, I would keep mentioning the Tuttils, but there were other people who were banner makers. There was one called Kenning, competing with Tuttils, and they used to put out catalogues, and they'd have a whole range of regalias and banners and stuff. They were very connected to, I think, the Oddfellows, one of the Oddfellow groups, but there were others that were purely commercial organisations.
Yeah.
Here in Newcastle, you had a whole range of regalia makers, and if you look under some of the flaps of the aprons, you'll find a stamp which says so-and-so and so-and-so, Adamstown or something like that, which is another reason why you have to go through the regalia very carefully for signs of that sort of thing. Now, I don't know, I haven't even drawn up a list of the people in Newcastle that were regalia makers, so I haven't even begun to research their backgrounds. I would suspect that certainly some of them would be members, some of them would have been, oh, no, that's a good idea, let's add that to our range.
Yeah.
You know, like another lollipop or something.
Quite popular, yeah.
Away they go. And if they produce a quality item, then the brothers and sisters start lining up, and away you go. But it's the same as in any commercial venture. It's often the big companies that drive out the small companies, and so you finish up with Blaskey's, I think it is, in Melbourne, is almost the only regalia maker now in Australia. There's all sorts of reasons for that, but in England, Tuttils were the best known makers of banners, and they did an extraordinarily good job. I can't find a history of Tuttils, the banner makers. Apparently they were bombed during the Second World War, you know, in the Blitz, and a lot of their stuff just disappeared. That's a big part of it. They would have had an amazing history because they were already 100 years old by that time. But anyway.
So are Blaschke's affiliated with the
I think they're very
societies?
Masonic. But you see, you get a family firm that's handed down from generation to generation. The founding father was probably a Freemason, but not necessarily the son. You carry it on. But almost none of that work has been done, so I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, that's okay. I just found it interesting myself, working on this stuff.
It is extremely interesting. And the people producing the certificates are the people who are introducing the new techniques.
And
of
they're also
printing
sort of proliferating that iconography and the symbolism. So,
absolutely.
It's quite
And I'm sure there are some companies that wouldn't produce certain certificates because of the iconography. Oh, no, we're not going to print that.
That's right.
We won't do that. We'll do this.
Yeah.
Okay. The money involved in producing regalia, in buying a piece of regalia or a set of regalia for a member, was quite often too much for the member to bear. So the member goes along to the executive and says, look, we've got to get rid of this regalia. It's too expensive, you know, we can't afford it. We're living from hand to mouth as it is. So you get certain pressures operating, which are very common in, you know, all sorts of situations, but you have them operating in the area around the fraternals. You can read material that's been printed of faction fights within, say, the Manchester Unity or the Rechabites or whatever. In some cases, the unsuccessful faction breaks off and forms its own organisation, goes independent or starts a new lodge. There was a mob here in Newcastle, Freemasons. Bloke went right up to the top, probably thought he should have been Grand Master. He was in everything, Knights Templars and all sorts of things. But for some reason, he became unhappy with Grand Lodge, set up his own Masonic organisation. Okay? And when he died, the family were faced with this huge accumulation of stuff, certificates and photographs and all sorts of things. Normally, members are expected to hand stuff back to head office, supposedly because there are secrets involved and secret rituals and all that. Okay, So some people do send it back, some people just dump it, some people hand it on to their children. This bloke had accumulated all of this stuff. The children looked around. What are we doing now? Oh, I've heard of this bloke called Bob James. He'll look up. And it arrives on my doorstep and I go, wow, what do I do now?
So this particular person, he was a member of lots of different...
What was his own lodge called? You said he started his own.
I'd have to look it up.
That's okay.
As I said, heart attacks make you a bit forgetful. That's what I mean.
I like forgettable. It's better. So when you were talking about the regalia of people having to purchase their own and then returning it back, that's a bit interesting topic. At meetings, did you have to wear the regalia every time? Or was it just at certain events?
Depends on the society. Freemasons, yes, because the regalia is actually a code. Right? It tells you what position you are in the lodge. It tells you who sits in front of you, who sits behind you, what power you have in the lodge meeting to start a debate or whatever. So the regalia is a code, and it follows all the way through to the highest level you can possibly go. Okay, and some of the people who became very high up in the Masons, for example, did that simply because they liked the idea of the status. They probably didn't know anything more about Freemasonry than anybody in the street. Some of that regalia cost thousands of dollars, well, thousands of pounds. Okay. As time went on and they were produced in more and more numbers, then the quality dropped. Prices had to be competitive because if this firm was charging too much, then they might go to somebody else. But nevertheless, there was quite a bit of money tied up in the regalia if you had been serious about it. And there's the whole, I haven't talked about women at all, but either from female Freemasons to the women who stayed at home and were called Masonic widows because their husband was out every night, practically every night. There are all sorts of stories just there. But the women, the bloke keels over in the backyard and she goes and looks under his bed and he's all this stuff and she says, what? Oh, this is why he was out at night. I hate the Freemasons. Whoosh, gone. Or she says, this was really important to him, so I can't throw it out. What can I do with it? Some of it turns up with me. Some of it, turns up in op shops and second-hand car yards, all sorts of places. I was going to say something else about secrecy. Secrecy is a function, right? It's not accidental. Somebody didn't stand up and say, I'm going to set up a secret society because I like the idea. It always had a function. Before 1789, just as a rough generalisation, it was an internal form which aided the operation of the organisation. It had very little to do with the authorities. But after 1789, and I don't know how much you know about the French Revolution, it became extremely important whether the government could control an organisation or not. If it's a secret organisation, almost by definition, the government can't control it. Because even if they go to a meeting and they have informers everywhere and infiltrate a group and whatever, you can never be sure that there isn't another group meeting out the back somewhere. And if the government decides that, those odd fellows, they're a bit seditious. They've been turning up at the peace marches over at so-and-so, or they've been turning up at the demonstration down the road. So we don't like the derivatives. So you set up legislation, and there's a whole series of legislation which gradually tightens the definition of what you can do and what you can't do. And the Australian story is a particularly interesting one because the First Fleet almost coincides with the French Revolution. So the decisions to set up the settlement at Port Jackson were formulated in the pre-1789 situation, right? But after 1789 has settled down and all these fraternities start appearing, the world has changed. The idea of a fraternity is quite different afterwards than it was before. So the idea of secrecy is there in all of them, but it's nowhere near as important as it was before. So these arguments break out within the lodge. Why do we do this? Why do we? And some of the fraternals simply say, "Oh, well, okay, we'll just do away with it." In some cases, they say, "Well, we'll keep this degree and that ritual, and we'll tell the government about it because it's not really dangerous to anyone, but we'll cut out all these others because they're wordy or they're overly religious or they cost too much money to stage or something else." So you get all sorts of adaptations occurring, but basically they're all being funneled in a certain direction, which has to do with the nature of the society that's forming, which is increasingly bureaucratic and increasingly conformist, and each generation, as I said, is being taught a particular story, so that the difficulties of convincing this membership that they have to do certain things is easier as time goes on, because they've grown up under the modified regime. So you've got this interesting situation where the Freemasons, the Loyal Orange Lodges, the United Irish Brotherhoods, and a few others arrive with the First Fleet, and they're heavily into conspiracies because they want to support Irish independence or they want to support something else. But after the military establishment in Sydney is closed down, they reappear as something that isn't sure what it wants to do. Some of them are very political, like the Loyal Oranges. Some of them just want to be an insurance society and look after its members. Some of them are just there to have a piss up.
So how do you think that they did sort of develop their own identity in Australia? Because I agree, I think Australia is quite a unique, geographically unique as well, just in terms of our white history and our geographic location. So it's quite a good sort of experiment for how these societies actually develop. As you say, they come over and they've got all these sort of residual ideas and
yeah, that's what I wanted to know too. You said with the British, and it started the Freemasonry and Masonry and all that began here. And then how did it start to change? Because you said you wanted to write more and talk more about the Australian version of the Freemasonry now. What's different now or back then?
Between what and what?
The British version that started here, and then how has it started to become more Australianised?
yeah, how has it evolved in Australia?
Well, it hasn't. That's part of the answer.
So it's still very
Because Australia is such a very English-oriented society, almost everywhere. And that's why the immigration programs and refugee things set off so many alarms, because it's been conformist for such a long time, and it's been educated under this Europocentric, basically English-oriented curricula. That there are attempts to reintroduce some of the missing knowledge, for example, about Indigenous Australians. That's happening as we speak. Women have sort of been reinserted back into the history, but that's 1970s, 1980s. If you read Manning Clark, if you read Manning Clark's biographies, you read about the struggles that he was having himself to write a new history of Australia but he actually talks about the things that are in his mind, and he can't make it work. He can't organise it because he doesn't know enough. He knows that there's a problem, but he doesn't know what the problem actually is because he's been taught under the old system. Now, there are some differences. There's a whole argument that's been going on now for 20 years or more. I went to a conference in Sheffield where there was a big centre of research into Freemasonry set up, and the bloke who was looking after it wanted to introduce dialogue between the trade unions and the Freemasons. But he did it. He had a conference, people arrived, they went away again, and it was a centre that was being funded by Grand Lodge in London. Funding disappeared. Couldn't continue. There's an argument going on informally now. It doesn't appear in public. It's going on informally exactly on this topic. How much of the real Masonic history do we allow to get into our Masonic publication, and how much of the standard mythology do we continue to present? And that argument is a very religious one. I was, just after I became a Freemason, I was set up by the Grand Master at the time to be part of a committee that was going to explore curricula for Freemasons to study their own Freemasonry. I got to the first meeting, about 8 or 9 blokes sitting around the table, and 2 of them were very reverends, very religious. They wiped the whole thing out because they weren't going to shift. The whole thing about, well, one part of the argument between the facts and false histories is about divine messaging. If you believe in God, then you can say that history is supposed to be centred. If you don't believe in God, you can say, oh, politicians are corrupt and they went off and burnt somebody's village down, and so on. But if you're religious, you can't put that in. So it's quite often boils down to a question of whether you believe in God or don't. And if you believe in God, which God you believe in? Getting back to your point, reading into the involvement of, for example, Freemasons in some of the Middle Eastern countries, particularly around the early 1900s, is very interesting. But it's very piecemeal. You've got to dig a bit out. That's why I was interested in that reference you gave me a couple of weeks ago. We're at the stage where we take a little bit here and a little bit from there and we put it together and say, oh, okay, what does that mean? Because it does mean something, but it usually doesn't mean what you've been told it means. The thing about the people producing the certificates in Bradford or Birmingham or whatever, there's a story there, but in most cases we don't know what the story is. But I can guarantee that it will be an important story, and it will probably change a lot of what you have taken for granted. Which is one reason why I sit here and I say to you before I even start that thing over there, what do you already know? What bias do you have that I have to get over? Because after 30 years plus, I'm quite convinced about what I've done, and I can see signs of improvement happening, but there are still a lot of doors closed. That Loyal Orange collection that I spoke of in Sydney, it's disappeared. Don't know where it is. Now it may have been destroyed. Oh, I didn't mention a particular point. The Loyal Oranges decided that they were a friendly society. They weren't in the beginning, but they decided they were. That allowed them to be registered and be legal. Okay. But the legislation says if you're a registered friendly society, you cannot participate in politics. Now, the members of the Loyal Oranges knew that they'd been very political, but they knew that if somebody said that, wrote down in a history book somewhere, look how political this lot were, the government would come along and say, you're not legal anymore. And so these people in Parramatta Road got very stroppy. When we arrived there, Tony Laffin and I started taking down questions. Now it's all disappeared. I don't know where it's gone.
Yeah.
There was a breakaway political party started by a bloke in Newcastle, the Loyal Oranges, and he stood for Parliament representing the Protestant Independent Labor Party, and he was totally maintained by the militant Protestants in Newcastle. As soon as he lost his seat in Parliament, which he did because the Labor Party organised the numbers against him, his organisation, not only the political party but the religious organisation, it just disappeared. It lost all its momentum. But you will still find people out in the bush somewhere, out around Coodale and Bathurst and places like that, where they were very strong. You'll still find people who remember certain things, or they have a photograph.
Yeah, I was going to ask that because, Indigenous cultures often have to just pass the stories through the family. When you started to say how some of these things are starting to disappear, the secrecy is becoming more secret. So who's going to still be around other than you to keep trying to find this history and record it?
Okay, I don't know the answer to that question.
Is it still there somewhere getting passed down?
Well, yes, but
secretly.
Every day goes on, a bit of it disappears. I went out to Coodale because I was told that there was a lot of regalia in a sheep shed. I was there, all right. It was in a great big box. But it was there along with the bird shit and the bird nests and a bit of this and newspapers. They knew it was important, but they didn't know why.
Yeah.
I'm not going to throw it out into the shed, and away you go.
I guess that's
one of the
quite a lot of
questions.
it, yeah.
One of the questions I often ask, or used to ask, was, have you got anything in your shed? So you just never know what you're going to find. I ask people who say they buy a goof building in Newcastle. I say, excuse me, have you been up in the attic? Have you been under the floorboards?
Yeah.
If you can imagine a 12-foot square banner that's no longer being used, what do you do with it? Well, you put it behind the door for a while, and it keeps falling over and hitting people on the head or whatever, and you think, oh, I don't really want to throw it out. I know, we'll stick it under the floor. Lithgow Trades Hall had murals on its wall for a long time. The mural of the symbols, basically, the same ones that were in the banners, that went back to the old days of fraternal societies. Until they had a faction fight, certain people said, we don't want this old stuff. It's got nothing to do with class warfare, it's got nothing whatever to do with what we're on about. So they painted it all over. It just disappeared. Now, I know about that story, but I've never seen a photograph of what was there before they painted it over. So it's a question of how quick you can be.
That's right.
There was a bloke who used to write for the Newcastle Morning Herald. He was a forester, but he was also interested in virtually every fraternal organisation that you could think of in Newcastle. And he used to write these very long columns for the Newcastle Morning Herald, the Protestant Alliance, the Rechabites, the Hibernians, almost daily. 20 years of columns. His house was full of stuff that he'd collected during his lifetime. When he died, his family came in, looked around, all gone. He had banners, certificates, he had all sorts of stuff on which he based his poems,
Yeah.
and it just all went
So throne.
through.
I noticed because we got those Kodak, the quite recent photos that you also donated of a trip that you did over to the UK. I think it was. Was that a trip that you did specifically to?
You'd have to remind me.
Well, they're colour photographs, and I'll see if I can actually pull out some. They're over there.
They weren't recent. I think we just recently got given them from.
Well, they're not.
Upstairs.
They're not as old as some of the other collections. Oh yeah, these ones here. Sure. So, these ones here, and I think some of them were definitely from overseas. These
Oh
ones
yes, that
from
might be
overseas.
accidental.
Yeah.
Keep going.
I was just wondering, how far afield have you gone looking for this kind of stuff?
It's more hit and miss than anything. Some of them have been taken from other publications, some of them have been photographed from walls. This one here, which is the Society of...
There it is written on the back.
No, it's all right. Royal United Order of Anglo-Saxons. Oh, I'd never heard of them, but I was in Brighton. There was a bloke in Brighton who was interested in this sort of stuff. His house was full of certificates and so on. He's died recently and his family has sold them all off, as I understand. But anyway, I came across a building which had Royal United Order of Anglo-Saxons on the top of it. So I just went in and knocked on the door. They had certificates, they had their own banner, and they were very interested in the fact that somebody else was interested, because they no longer thought of themselves in this way.
Yeah.
You can just see just from the symbols that are on the certificate itself what they used to be interested in. Now they, what's that, 24 grade, yeah. It's been hit and miss. A, because I wasn't funded. B, because I didn't really know where to go. But after a while you get the sense of, if you go almost anywhere, you're going to find stuff.
Yeah.
Because it was so widespread.
You have purchased some things online. Some of the, I think we saw some eBay receipts or something as well.
Oh,
Perhaps.
probably.
Yeah.
You have, like what you were explaining, you have addressed some what I would call success stories. For example, David Jones as a person who turned out to make an institution that these days is functioning,
Yeah.
and they have an archive. Or Henry Parks, for whatever reason, turned out to be a politician and someone that we call it like famous person for good and bad decisions that he made. How many of these names you can recall or think of? Maybe not now, but maybe for the next meeting that we have, so we can have a little bit of a story. Because one thing that I think would help us is that, see, if we know that there is a David Jones, and David Jones, everybody likes it. I mean, certainly with your experience, you wouldn't say that, Freemason right on the top. But we can go and search the archives and build up the story, and then, yeah, by the way, this famous story is a part of the Freemasonry or Fraternal Society.
Yeah. That is the way to go.
Yeah,
But we're only just scratching the surface.
yeah.
The different people responded in different ways. There's a politician in New South Wales called McGowan, and he was largely responsible for the introduction of government payments to unemployed or to sick people or whatever.
Yeah.
And out of that grew national insurance and then Medicare and all of that stuff. He was a fraternal, very strongly fraternal, I think Protestant Alliance. But he said these societies are struggling to keep this thing going. So the government has to step in and take over. As soon as the government steps in, then the reason for having the benefit societies disappears.
Exactly.
But you have a transition period when the argument is going on. National insurance is a very good example of this evolution, this process of adaptation. Some of the fraternals were very much in favour of government support. Some of them saw it as the worst thing that could possibly happen. But that argument might go on for 10 years, 20 years.
Yes.
The Australian Natives Association is another different example again.
Yeah.
Organised as a friendly society, but it never participated in the sorts of things that other friendly societies did. It was set up to enable federation to be made in Australia.
Exactly.
People like Henry Parkes were involved in that process, but he was never a member of the ANA. But Alfred Deakin was, and a whole bunch of very well-known
But the
politicians.
guy that university is named after him.
Mm. Yeah, but that hasn't been. I certainly haven't written that stuff down in a catalogue form. But I was thinking that when I first started out, I was keeping a trade unionist index. I have been wondering what to do with that because it's not terribly well kept. I haven't added anything to it for a while, but there's probably be dozens and dozens of names on that. Any one of which I'd be pretty sure is part of the fraternal story.
Yeah.
Either because of their trade union connections or because they were also Rechabites or Freemasons or whatever.
And do you know, just speaking of local significance, there's a figure called Thomas Crowdis who's being investigated at the moment as well. Crowdis House.
By who?
The Collier. By us, actually. We're doing a project on it. But
Sorry,
was he...
why are you spending time on Thomas Crowdis
When?
rather than what you're supposed to be doing?
No, not
When?
us, just the university. The university's looking into him, and I was just
Please
wondering...
use the word us very carefully.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry, not us personally. The university is looking into company. Do you know if he was affiliated, if he was a member of a particular society?
I don't know, but I would say undoubtedly.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely, I guarantee it. Well,
Would you agree if we consider that, like, what the Freemasonry has, fraternal society in general? Sorry, I say Freemasonry because in my original language, all the fraternal
It's
societies
the-
are the
yeah.
Freemasonry.
exactly.
That's
Yeah.
Yeah.
history, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what we're
Yeah. And you'll still have that story told
Yeah.
by different people. Yeah.
Are the equivalent of what today we call grassroots politics, the politics that starts from people who are not on the top,
Mm.
but they are who are on the not the bottom of society, but gain the power and action and agency through being together and acting for change or doing something from within the society rather
Yeah,
than
yeah.
from upon the society. So if that's something that you would be agree with, I think it would be the way that we look into the collection.
Except that because we're talking about a long time frame and because the rules keep changing,
Yes.
you get different responses. It's not Well, an example. I was talking with Tony yesterday about the larrikin gangs in Sydney and other places. He's been doing a lot of work with Singleton Historical Society, and he tells me that there was a larrikin gang, for want of a better label, I'm not quite sure what we call it, in Singleton that had its own ritual, its own colour-coded ceremonial, and its own internal disciplines. Now they decided that that was a good thing to do for their purposes because of what they already knew about fraternals. But they wouldn't have said, oh, we borrowed that from the Freemasons, or we borrowed that from the Hibernians. There was just a general sense, this is what you do. Okay, perhaps their father was, the father of one of the organisers was a member of a trade union or whatever, and the notion of secrecy, regalia, discipline, insiders and outsiders, that's sufficient. If you go to a Masonic lodge meeting today, you will have somebody on the floor introducing a motion about poker machines or introducing women into the organisation, and they will be doing exactly what you're talking about. But the response will often be, we have to wait for Grand Lodge to tell us what to do. So this conflict between top-down versus bottom-up is exactly what the French Revolution was actually about. And that's why I'm saying the story of fraternal societies before 1789 is quite different to what it is afterwards.
Yeah.
And the Australian situation sits right on the cusp because of the coincidence of the French Revolution with the First Fleet. You go to at the John Hunter Hospital, where I've just spent a bit of time, and you'll find the nurses confabulating in a corner. What are they doing? They're organising.
Yeah.
Informally, might be totally innocuous, it may be of major importance. But the nurses and midwives and so on walked out at Blacktown Hospital. That was organised from the grassroots. They might be able to bring about change, or they might get wiped out by the AMA or by the Australian College of GPs or something. It's a struggle that's going on all the time.
Yes.
And it's that struggle which you can use to get into fraternities. I wouldn't generalise and say they're all grassroots organisations, or they're not grassroots. Ladies of the Court in Melbourne, which is another fraternal society which nobody's heard about, very, very conservative. Very, very conservative. And they were there to support the status quo. Other organisations just down the road were there to undermine the status quo. And in lots of, and that's where secrecy becomes a talking point again, because so much of it is being done out the back in a secret room somewhere, behind your hand.
Yeah.
Secrecy, I think, is a major topic which could be used to get into what you're talking about. And the last thing I'd say, I'm sure you've had enough of this, but the last thing is that people who get interested in fraternal societies wonder about where the idea came from. Some say it goes back to the Romans. Some say it goes back to the Greeks. Some say, oh no, it was part of the wisdom which came through from the Middle East because of Middle Eastern societies. And there is certainly evidence of Middle Eastern society, brotherhoods, fraternities. And I think that's an important part of the story. But I'm sure it's not the only part of the story, because I argue that the notion of fraternity is almost in our genes. It's a survival mechanism. It doesn't depend upon the British Empire. It doesn't depend upon Catholicism. It's something that we do. As kids, we probably formed our own secret society. You know, we had symbols on the back of our hand. things hanging off our ears or
Yeah,
know,
dress.
they-
It's a system of belonging, and it's also decentralised authority. And people like to dissent against centralised
But it
authority.
doesn't have to be dissent. You might be totally supportive of the status quo,
Mm.
but you want to identify in a certain way in order that you survive. It's very, very basic. And you can, if you follow it logically to think about it, you can see that the various notions of initiating somebody, excluding outsiders, setting up a colour-coded regalia, setting up secrets, setting up means of recognition is all part of that simple idea of surviving. And at certain times, the way in which you survive depended upon you being able to recognise who was a friend and who was an enemy. But in other cases, in other places, it didn't matter. Okay? But the more I look into this stuff, and I'm still digging, I find that there are secret fraternities all over the place.
I basically think that it's an evolutionary phenomenon. Because,
Out of human
yeah,
evolution.
yeah, because humans, apart from other animals, is not a strong creature. It doesn't have great power, it can't run fast, it doesn't see far, it doesn't act fast.
Blobs.
Yeah, so if you consider human in the evolution, like early primate evolution time, it's a very weak creature. Its power only comes when it shapes a group.
Yeah, when it.
It's our intellect that makes us powerful.
Yeah, and
Intellect.
Well, I don't know, yeah,
Yeah.
you can call it intellect. I think Amir's right. It's. I think it's part
It's
of
the
human
power we give
nature,
ourselves.
but it's not human nature because other animals do exactly the same thing. They club together in different ways. But then you have to ask, you confronted with the question of why don't we talk about it? It's such a huge disconnect between the reality. It's almost basic. It's almost something that we should start in kindergarten talking about. It's a disconnect between the reality and what is actually in the history books. It's just enormous the more you think about it.
I guess there's still quite vast debate on what is human nature as well.
Yeah.
People, I still don't know what's innate and what's,
Well, it's good. I'm glad you don't know.
No. But I guess that would add to that.
That's
Why we don't talk about it.
That's why we construct gods and stuff.
Yeah, we make
Because
our
it
own.
provides an easy answer.
Yeah, and I guess that's why we create our own societies as well in that light. Yeah.
And if we're living in the Sahara Desert, the society that we form will be different to if we're still living in the trees in Borneo somewhere. But they may very well have the same ideas. They may follow a similar pattern. Now, there's no doubt that the societies that came to Australia were formulated in a particular way because of what they had learned in Britain. But I wonder what might have been the case if they'd all come by boats as refugees from Ceylon or Borneo or somewhere else. What would they have done when they hit the beach? Almost certainly they would have started some sort of mutual aid society, but there would have been some bloke up the front who says, no, you're not going to make that decision, I'm going to make the decision. And the fighting breaks out. So it's very much about power. Power analysis and what you do when you find yourself in a conflict situation. The other thing that we don't talk enough about is violence. Whether you're talking about the invasion of Australia and the suppression of the Aborigines, or whether you're talking about domestic situations, or whether you're talking about the Freemasons fighting against the Hibernians or whatever, you're talking eventually about violence. Violence is a very good way into this stuff, but violence has also been left out of the history books. It said the British Empire went around the world planting the flag and saying, aren't we terrific?
On the topic of violence and the first arrivals that you mentioned, I particularly am interested in two figures, so just checking with you, and maybe it would be another discussion for another year, but just putting the General Philip, the commander of the
Captain.
Captain Philip, yeah, and Morissette, Major Morissette. Is there any account or any link or any sign that either of these two have been member of any fraternal group or society?
Off the top of my head, I don't know of any.
Yeah.
Philip is the one of those two that interested me more. He was a spy, a military spy. The interesting thing about these people that you mentioned, and a whole bunch of others like Bligh and Macquarie and a whole bunch of others, is that it's the question of why they were appointed to the positions that they were appointed. Is it a result of some fraternal connection? Or is it of the way that the settlement in New South Wales was seen? Oh yeah, we'll send him off over there, we'll get rid of him. It's not really important. No, not one of the people who became governors of New South Wales seemed to me to be qualified.
Yeah, that's the point.
In the 19th century, you get somebody like Edward John Eyre, who became governor of South Australia, and there are photographs, statues of him all over the place. He failed when he was a similar kind of position in Canada, and he provoked a whole situation, and the government eventually had to pull him out and send him off somewhere else. In the case of Philip, he was a middle-ranking military spy. He'd been sent off to France to try and work out how many boats the French were building during the time of the Revolution. Morissette, I know very little about. If you go to somewhere like Norfolk Island, which was an adjunct to the convict settlement in Sydney, you'll find in the cemetery all sorts of Masonic headstones. But there's very little history about the Freemasons on Norfolk Island. It's a little bit here and a little bit there, and a little bit. But the headstones are quite imposing. It's not even certain that there was a Masonic lodge there because the records haven't survived. But there was certainly something going on there.
Yeah, the graves are themselves good records.
Yeah. Well, they lasted a lot longer than some other things. But the other thing about that is that there seem to be as many non-officers in the lodge, if there was a lodge, as there were officers. In some places you'll only get officers in the Masonic lodges. You won't get the ranks. But some of the ranks on Norfolk Island were pleading with the Grand Lodge in Dublin to allow them to set up a lodge. Grand Lodge in Ireland said, piss off. We don't want to know. Because they were just troopers. But why did the troopers decide that they wanted to have a Masonic lodge? You'd have to speculate.
Or was it maybe that part of that identity and wanting to still be connected to something, you know?
Yeah, but what would they know about it?
Not sure.
They didn't say, oh, well, I was a member of a lodge before I came to Norfolk Island. So where did you get the idea from?
Yeah, didn't know the tradition and the rules of it, I guess.
I guess maybe they just picked one of the most popular ones and went.
How did they know it was popular?
That's right.
No.
It was a secret society in those days. It was almost banned by the British government in 1799. It was listed as one of the secret societies that were going to be banned. And it was only interventions by Grand Lodge in London that stopped it, gave it an exemption under the legislation. So at the time these troopers were writing, it was a very dicey thing to be doing. Where did they get the idea from? What did they have in mind? I don't know.
Nice family connections.
Bob, I'll ask one last question, then we'll let you go and relax. And it's the oranges.
Does that run forever?
That's a 5-hour
Oh,
thing
okay.
at the moment, yeah. And it's
No, no,
charged
but-
into the power,
yeah,
left
but I
into the
think,
power.
yeah, which will be last
Yeah.
question,
So
because
last
it
one,
is,
and it's just based on the oranges because
Based on
the oranges, there's not that many loyal oranges in what we've been working on, but I assume, and you know about them and you've written about them, So have you got more in your collection
Yes,
to come?
yes.
So it's in the regalia and the...
It's in the regalia.
Because you bought some that day that the NBN came of the regalia.
That's because I'm particularly interested in them, and because they were very strong here in the valley. The person to talk to is Tony Laffin, and I'm hoping that he will be added to some sort of speakers list or whatever. See, there are so many possibilities with this material. Whatever you think, but you in particular, Amir, whatever you think is the way to systematise the information, whether it be card systems or whether it be, I don't know, catalogues or whatever, that's fine, because most of that stuff hasn't been done. As I said before, I couldn't reach up onto the bookshelf and pull it down because there weren't any. That's one of the things that we are now confronted with. In order to we have to provide those sorts of guides to the material. Some of it will be biographical, some of it will be historical. As far as the Loyal Oranges are concerned, they are particularly important to this area, and that's the reason for some of my interest. But also I think they represent a very clear example of the diversity of fraternal societies. And that became the central question. How is it that the Catholics and the Protestants, in setting up their different fraternities, followed the same pattern?
And for you as a Catholic Freemason, so this is interesting too.
Well, yes, but I didn't tell the Freemasons I was a Catholic.
Yeah, okay.
And I'm a lapsed Catholic as far as that's concerned, because I didn't believe the Catholic histories any more than I believe the Protestant histories. The Loyal Oranges are particularly of interest because they were clearly a political organisation. They were clearly a secret organisation because they didn't want their political activities to be known. Some of the Catholics would have known what they were up to, and so they organised against them. But if you kept it very low key and you just turned up when Henry Parkes wanted a street campaign or something, that was fine. You didn't actually say that all of that area there is going to vote for Henry Parkes at the time. You can keep it out of that. But the signs are there. There's a very clear indication of an organisation which is totally political, is very well located in small communities and villages and so on, because I've got the regalia from Dungog, or from Pellor, Maine, or from, there's one called, not Kangaroo Flat, but I looked it up on the map and it's a tiny, tiny little spot, but it has its own regalia. Now, perhaps that was an aberration. Perhaps somebody came around and said, look, we printed off this regalia for Footrock Flats or something. Oh yeah, we don't have a lodge out there. Who knows? But there are certainly, Coodale is a very small place, but it had its own lodge, it had its own regalia, had its own women's lodge, etc., etc., etc. It's a huge and fascinating area. What can I say?
Maybe cementing their place in history, trying to, but I mean accidentally not really doing that, because the fraternal societies have been kind of swept under the rug, as you say, in terms of history, historical records.
Were you trying to book my vanity there for a minute?
No. I was just saying that's why they actually.
Oh, why they? See, that's why
Not you. No. But like Kudal, maybe
Sure.
that's part of actually just, so and so was here.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean that's another part of the thing. You've got to. You can look at what it says in the history book, and then you look at the fact that here are these people in Kudal, for example, and amongst all this regalia are all these trumpets made out of metal. There's at least a dozen of them at my place.
Yeah, is that the photograph that you've got in?
Yeah. Why were these people in a sheep raising area with all these trumpets? Well, it means that they believed, that they felt that they needed those trumpets, those trumpets, perhaps there were an enthusiasm that just one member was particularly fond of, or perhaps it was something that was general. But you have to look at the reality, which is quite often manifest in what you find. It's not in the history books. And so you've got to say, well, do I rewrite the history books in the light of what I know about this reality? Or do I just say, oh, well, there's a bit of a conflict here. Or women might be in history and they might not be, you know. It's not up to me to say. But I've convinced myself that the story is a particular way, and I'm still rewriting it. And you're going to have to... Is Bob talking rubbish, or is he onto something here?
He's onto something.
Perhaps I should ask Bob.
Which one?
Which one? Okay, so
Thank you so much.
thank you very much for your
That's
time
all right.
today.
And let Amir know which day you would like to come next.
They tell me that you've organised me for a day,
16.
16th.
Yeah, it would be Wednesday.
Which Bob didn't know that.
No,
so-
you were talking about the 10th.
I know that was
No.
when they're coming to visit you.
Oh,
On the 10th,
oh.
we come and visit
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Not this thing,
Yeah, no.
Sarah and Essie.
Yeah, no, that's right. Forgive me, I'm very forgetful.
It's all right.
It's
I
okay.
have to write everything down.
Yeah.
I'm a bit forgetful
So you've
too,
got
and
all
I
that
haven't had a
written?
heart attack, so yeah.
Not yet. You will.
Yeah, he's got you down for
I was
2
forgetful.
weeks.
I was forgetful when I was a young kid. I used to play hockey a lot,
Mm.
and they'd say, "You coming tomorrow, Bob?" And I'd say, "What? What? Why would I be going?" Oh, it's the hockey game tomorrow all
It's
day.
the final.
And I'd say, "Oh,
You're a goalie. You should be there.
We need you.
Yeah, that's right.
I
Okay,
don't-
so
I
as long as
don't-
you've got all that written down, then you're good.
yeah, I
Because
did
yeah,
that.
they're coming to your place next week.
Apparently so.
Yep.
Oh, I think I've
Confirm
written
that.
that down. Also.
Yeah. Amir shall confirm.
I turned up one afternoon to have a bit of a hit around with the ball on the paddock, and I found that our carnival was just finishing.
Not your carnival.
Where you been, James? We had to play one man show.
It's all right. Yeah.
No, I
Good memory
appreciate.
isn't
I
necessarily.
appreciate your interest. It's a big change from what used to be the case. But what I see happening around here is something I thought might happen,
Yeah,
but it is happening. So
absolutely.
I'm quite happy to fit in with whatever plans you have.
Yeah, I basically think that after we do these set of interviews, then I sit and have a chat with you. You might bring some people like a gentleman